Welcome to the Times of Israel's Friday Focus. I'm your host, Amanda Borschel-Dan. This week here with our political correspondent, Sam Sokol, while Lazar Berman is still on reserve duty. Today is Friday, May 23rd, day 594 of the war. Sam, thanks so much for joining us today.
Pleasure, Amanda.
You have been delving into the issue of the ultra-Orthodox draft, both in the Knesset and on the streets. And today we're going to dive into some of this rigorous reporting and talk about the history of how these exemptions began, where we are now, the history of the Haredi community here in Israel. What is this very diverse community? We're also going to talk about the political power that this community wields, both in the past and the present. So there's a lot to discuss, all of this and more when we're back.
Jews have to learn to walk and chew gum at the same time. Thank you, Mr. President, for Jerusalem. No, thank you for banning Arabs. His message on anti-Semitism is a good message. Trump is saying all the right things, and he may even be doing the right things, but for the wrong reasons. It's a dilemma for us, but I think we still have to stand up for the institutions, for due process, even if the wrong things that he's doing help us in the long term.
I just don't see how they help us at all, because I think in the long
run, there needs to be consequences. You can go up, you can march with a Palestinian flag. God bless you. That's fine. But if you use that flag to stop a Jewish students to go to class or beat them up, that's not freedom of speech. There needs to be consequences.
And we're back. I'm Amanda Borschel-Dan here with our political correspondent, Sam Sokol. So, Sam, this week we learned that only 1,212 or 5% of the 24,000 notices that were sent to the ultra-Orthodox community since July 2024. These are the notices for the draft notices. Only 5% were actually, heeded is, I guess, the word, and that these men actually showed up to the induction centers. So this is a really terrible statistic for anyone who has, children in the IDF like I do. But we're going to talk about how this came about. And so just to begin with, Sam, what are Haredim? What is this?
So anyone from the U.S. would be familiar with Quakers. Haredi is just Hebrew, essentially the Hebrew word for Quaker. It means someone who shakes or shivers before God, who quakes before God. And basically, in the 19th century, at the beginning of modernity, we saw both the beginning of the Reform movement and the conservative movement, efforts to change Judaism to bring it up to date with secular norms, and as a sort of polar opposite, as a sort of action-reaction, we had many of the ultra-religious go in the opposite direction and create what is essentially known as Haredi Judaism today. There's two types of Haredim. You have the Hasidim, people who follow Hasidic Judaism, and you have the so-called Lithuanian stream, the Litvaks, who are not Hasidic. And the one thing that sort of binds all of the Haredim together in all of their complexity is, generally speaking, this pushback against modernity, this idea that anything new or innovative is wrong. So their entire ideology is premised on this idea that they are preserving tradition, preserving an ancient way of life. But in doing so, in creating this new stream of Judaism, they have, just as much as the Reform or the modern Orthodox or the conservative, they have innovated and really changed things a great deal. Whereas if you look in, for instance, in the Talmud or the later rabbinic writings up through, a couple hundred years ago, even 100 years ago, you saw this emphasis on working for a living. There's a Talmudic saying, that someone who doesn't teach his child a profession teaches him to steal. You have Maimonides writing in the Mishnah Torah, the famous medieval Jewish law code, that somebody who decides that he's going to study Torah all day and live off of charity is demeaning Judaism. And what the Haredim have done is create essentially a society of learners, a community in which the expectation is that grown men will spend much of their life in full-time Talmud study, eschewing work, and really separating themselves off from a traditional Jewish way of life in that regard. And the ultra-Orthodox, there was really a belief after the Second World War, after the Holocaust, when so many of the Jewish communities of Europe were just destroyed, that ultra-Orthodoxy and Orthodoxy in general were on the way out, that the Reform and conservative movements were on the ascent, and Orthodoxy was going to disappear. And that's the reason why, getting back to the enlistment issue, why back in the late 1940s, David Ben-Gurion, the first Prime Minister of Israel, agreed to create an exemption from military service for ultra-Orthodox people who were learning full-time in yeshiva. There was a feeling in the Haredi community that they had to rebuild the institutions and the communities that had been destroyed, and they really wanted to create a new rabbinic leadership, really try to preserve themselves. And Ben-Gurion thought these people are going to disappear anyway, essentially. Let's allow them to get out of the army. Now, in 48, during the War of Independence, many ultra-Orthodox people enlisted, many ultra-Orthodox people fought, but you had Ben-Gurion saying that these 400 full-time yeshiva students, people who Torato Umanoto, for whom Torah is their profession, can be exempt. And this was something that was, considered a minor issue. They weren't a big group. But as the Haredi population began to grow and grow and grow until now, where they're around 14% of the population, it's become a very big issue, especially after Menachem Begin's first Likud government in 1977, when the cap on the number of people who could be exempted under Torah U'Manoto was completely lifted. So at the moment, many Haredi men learn in kollels, yeshivas for married men, and we have only 54% of Haredi men actually employed at the moment. For women, the rates are much higher, at 81%, only 2% less than their non-Haredi counterparts. The Haredi women also tend to be less educated than their secular counterparts, meaning that even though they have a comparable workplace participation rate, they are making a lot less. And one recent study that actually came out in recent days showed that Haredim as a community only pay 4% of total national taxes in terms of, I'm not talking about value-added tax, sales tax, but in terms of direct taxation, 4% of the total nationally.
Okay, so let's break this down. You've said a lot in these past, 8 minutes or so, and I'd like to refine what is Haredi society even further, because I really love how you frame this as just another stream of Judaism in response to modernity, just as Reform Judaism is and conservative Judaism and Orthodoxy, and then we have, of course, ultra-Orthodoxy or Haredi stream of Judaism. I love that. And the society here in Israel and around the world, very much so, but in Israel is of bubbles of these communities in certain places throughout the country. There are, of course, major cities in the state of Israel, such as Bnei Brak, which is, even 99% probably by this point, Haredi or ultra-Orthodox. And then there are other places, other bubbles in the West Bank, and I'm talking about Beitar Illit or Modi'in Illit, which are cities really cities within the West Bank full of Haredim, both major streams, as you mentioned, Hasidim and the Litvak Mitnagdim, those who are not Hasidim, essentially. And these are just amazing hives of activity, because one of the things to the Haredi community's credit is that they really take care of their own in so many ways. And so there's the idea of the Gemach, which is the Gemilut Hasidim, or these organizations, that acts of loving kindness in English, I think we translate it, but these organizations that were grassroots organizations to fill a need in a specific community. It could be even for, pacifiers. It could be for wheelchairs. It could be for any number of things that this grassroots need was filled by. It could be from an apartment, or it could be, a small little organization that grew into a major organization such as Yad Sarah, which is a nationwide organization that lends out medical equipment, but grew out of the Haredi community from each member taking care of the other members of society. So while secular Israelis, and there's studies on this too, I think even before the war in 2021, there was a study that something like 38% of secular Israelis hate Haredi Israelis because they just view them as leeches on society. But within their own society, they're really taking care of each other. What do you think about that, Sam?
I think you've raised a very interesting and important point here. Some of these Haredi organizations, like Yad Sarah, as you mentioned, or Zaka, which takes care of the bodies of terror victims, really do a lot for mainstream Israeli society. But you also have to understand that while this is true, and some of these organizations really do a lot for society as a whole, there's a lot of resentment because of one major defining fact of the Haredi community, which we haven't mentioned, which is separatism. Modern Haredi Judaism is based on the idea of separating from the larger society, including Jewish society around it, in order to maintain itself and to minimize outside influences culturally and religiously. So that's the reason why, for instance, you have so few Haredim in the workforce, so few Haredim in universities, and so few Haredim actually serving in the military. And by many metrics, they are not contributing to the country economically or in terms of security, which is what is generating this anger, because there's a feeling that the Haredim see themselves as a nation apart. You also have to understand, though, that there's a certain degree of legitimate worry on the part of the Haredim, meaning during the early years of the state, many of the institutions of the state, everything from the Histadrut Labor Federation to the political parties to the military, were used as vehicles for imbuing people in Israel with this new Israeli spirit, trying to bring people into a new culture and mix people in. And the Haredim had I think, a legitimate concern in the early years that there would be a certain amount of secularization of their community. And the issue today is that even in a period when the army is trying to create Haredi-only tracks that meet all of their standards, I personally served in one of those units in Netzach Yehuda, Nachal Haredi as it's known, for 2 years. And I know that the army and the government are trying to accommodate them, but there's still this feeling the Zionists want to assimilate us, they want to secularize us, and that's a very big concern on their part. I think that their objections to military service largely come down to two things. One is, often action will breed ideology rather than ideology breeding action. And since the rise of the Kollel system, they've come to the belief, and certain ideologies have become more dominant, including the idea that they are protecting Israel through their Torah learning, that the soldiers in the field can't fight and Iron Dome can't intercept missiles if yeshiva boys aren't sitting 24/7 and learning. So on the one hand, they think this. On the other hand, they feel if they go to the army, it will destroy their community. And polling that has shown that a majority of Haredim actually believe that their contributions, economically and in terms of security, are equivalent or greater than that of other Israelis. So this is really a deeply entrenched belief system that we're dealing with here.
Let's go to a short break.
What surprised you the most discovering about Jewish life in the United States?
I think it's the pride. I think I was envy of that pride. Just being proud, being a proud Jew. It's something that I never even contemplated. I was just an Israeli. I think the fact that, in Israel, we have all sort of sectors in society. You kind of grow up with your kind. I hate that. The fact that I don't know a lot about my Jewish life and I need to go abroad just to understand that. It's something so messed up and how we grew up here. It's just, I think once it got political to be Jewish in Israel, it made me kind of push away from that. Once I got to LA, once I got just being with my daughters abroad, just understanding what we are, my heritage, where we come from, our story, our values. Took me a long time to get there.
And we're back. I'm Amanda Borschel-Dan here with our political correspondent, Sam Sokol. Sam, we're talking about essentially the Haredi community, and we've discussed how diverse it is and how it too has its own struggles with identity, struggles with the push-pull of modernity, and struggles, making a living. Because honestly, the Haredi community is among the poorest, if not the poorest, in Israel. And I have a sense that a lot of that has to do with its insularity, of course, and obviously because the majority of men are, or 47% of men are not actually working, at least in any kind of legal way. And I have to wonder if there's any sense that the younger generation of the Haredi community is kind of fed up with just being so poor all the time. Are you hearing anything about that, Sam?
Look, I think there's definitely, people in the community who want things to change. We've seen the rise of a subgroup called the modern Haredim, who are much more open to the outside world. I personally live in a neighborhood which is partially Haredi, which includes many Haredim who have smartphones, who do work jobs. Many of them happen to be foreign-born. There's a huge difference between foreign-born Haredim, especially from the United States and Europe, and Israeli Haredim. Foreign Haredim tend to be much more modern in their outlook comparatively, but there's definitely people who would like to work and would like to serve in the army. The issue is that because it's such an insular community, there are incredible social pressures. If you're modern Orthodox or you're secular and you have a problem in your neighborhood, you get up and you move. If you're Haredi, and you do something that people don't like, you could be banned from schools. You could have trouble finding a match for your children, relatives. A good example is the Ger Hasidic sect, which split, and you had people from the two different sects who essentially cut each other off, brother against brother, sister against sister, children against their parents. So the stakes are very, very high in a way that's sort of hard to understand for people outside of that community.
And so much of life is under scrutiny, meaning if you see a person holding a smartphone who isn't supposed to be, then they could be told upon, and then the rumor mill just spreads. And as you said, the consequences can be really life-changing. So that's about the community. Now let's discuss a little bit more about the leadership and specifically the political leadership. You know so much more than I do about this and everything else we're talking about, obviously. But one thing that has always puzzled me is that the political leadership is actually under the religious leadership, it appears to me, meaning each of these different sects has its own little forgive me for saying this, but its own little pope. And that pope is making all the decisions for the political echelon. Is that an accurate description?
I don't think that the Haredim would particularly appreciate the word pope, but I think that in this case, it's actually very apt because there's a concept which has grown greatly in the Haredi community since the early part of the 20th century. This is something that developed alongside the Agudat Yisrael political party in Poland during the interwar years, which is a concept called Dat Torah, or as the Haredim would say, Das Torah. And what Das Torah is this idea that the rabbis, by virtue of studying so much Torah, are basically infallible on any topic. It's the Jewish version of papal infallibility, which is also a pretty modern development in the Catholic world. But you have this idea that once you learn enough Talmud, even if you're cloistered in yeshiva, you've never had experience as a community rabbi or any sort of secular education, you are qualified to make binding policy statements. And while things in practice are never quite as simple as in reality, you have activists who control flow of information to rabbis or influence them. You have many of these rabbis are elderly and dependent on aides. But essentially the idea is, yes, the political leadership is subordinated to the rabbis, to the yeshiva deans and the Hasidic rebbes. And what has happened in basically in the last year, has been a major pushed by the rabbis and the Haredi politicians to pressure Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu to pass a law exempting yeshiva students again. Because last summer, after decades of the High Court sort of skirting the issue, saying that exempting Haredim is illegal, but giving the government pass after pass to try to legislate solutions, the court finally put its foot down and said, these exemptions are illegal, period, end of story. They all have to go to the army. So the Haredi rabbis have said, many of these prominent rabbis have said two things. One, nobody's going to the army, not only the people who don't learn at all, but even the people who work. Nobody's going to the army, period. And two, they have actively instructed their followers not to go in, both through public statements, public letters, lectures, and even an ecosystem of hotlines to give advice to people who receive draft orders. All of these groups, which essentially tell people when they call, you should crumple up your draft order, throw it in the trash, don't show up, come back to us when there's an arrest warrant against you, and we'll give you some legal counsel and maybe some legal aid. So there's been this real push by the Haredim to try to re-legislate their exemption, something which is going to be very difficult because it's not particularly politically palatable to other members of the coalition, and anything that the Knesset could pass, which would be acceptable to the Haredim, would likely be struck down by the court almost immediately.
Right. And we're seeing increasingly that many of the coalition partners, those who should ostensibly support any kind of legislation that is deemed worthy to continue talking about, debating, and pass through, that increasingly there are, I wouldn't call it rebellions, but there's definitely pushback. And one of those major voices is the head of the Foreign Affairs and Defense Committee, and that is Yuli Edelstein. Yuli Edelstein is, of course, a hero to many Israelis for his stance when he was in Russia. He is a prisoner of Zion, and he is a very principled person. And he came to Israel and did all sorts of things and eventually joined Likud and has slowly moved up in the ranks and is considered one of the more popular characters until the past several years. In any case, he seems to be taking a stance that is very principled, in my opinion, at least. We'll see, how history tells it in the future. But he's really objecting to any kind of more of the flimsy laws that have been pushed in the meantime. So tell us what's happening in the Foreign Affairs and Defense Committee.
Well, first of all, just it's important as sort of context here to know that there are currently around 80,000 draft age Haredi men in Israel who are not serving in the army. The IDF has said that it's currently facing a manpower shortage of 12,000 soldiers. And out of those 12,000 soldiers that they need 7,000 combat troops. So there's a real pressing push to get the Haredim to the army. The representatives of the Army Manpower Directorate have told the Foreign Affairs and Defense Committee over and over and over, we need the Haredim in the Army, and we need effective personal sanctions on the Haredim to get them in. There have been efforts previously, legislatively, such as the Tal Law, which was passed in 2002, to get the Haredim into the Army. And the Tal Law set increasing quotas to get Haredim over time into the Army, but the sanctions were delayed sanctions, very weak sanctions, and the law didn't bring anyone in. And there seems to be an agreement that unless the Haredim, who are very dependent on government subsidies to live, unless there's some sort of financial sanction on them, they will have no reason to go into the army. It has to be something that that deals with sanctions. Now, Edelstein's committee has been dealing for a long time with a proposed bill which would very slowly raise the number of Haredim into the army. And it is a bill that many in the coalition would like to modify. Edelstein himself finished the final hearings on the bill several weeks ago and has said in the coming weeks he will release a new draft of it. And if he is consistent with his previous rhetoric, it is likely to include very harsh individual sanctions on Haredim who do not go to the army. And this is very likely to exacerbate the current coalition crisis with the ultra-Orthodox parties, which have repeatedly threatened to bring down the government over the issue. They've backed down every time, but if we come to a situation in which the government is actively pushing a bill, or there's a bill on the table that would be against their interests, it's a possibility that they might actually pull out and leave. Edelstein himself has said that he thinks things could just blow up in the next few weeks. So we're waiting to see what happens with that. We recently actually passed another mini coalition crisis when the army actually launched a physical operation within Israel to arrest draft dodgers. The Haredim said, if one Haredi man is arrested, we are quitting. And in the end, not one Haredi man was arrested, even though Haredim make up the majority of dodgers.
And instead, let me just break in, Sam. I know anecdotally, one of my daughter's friends who has served in the reserves for over 400 days and decided that he'd had enough mentally and physically, and he decided not to go back to base. I'm not condoning that behavior, but this is a person who served over 400 days in Gaza. He was among those who was arrested in that operation a couple of weeks ago. So I mean, tempers are very high between the two communities, but it's just actually really fascinating to point out, Sam, that if the Haredim actually do crumble the coalition, topple the coalition, they will be really heroes to so much of secular Israel. So, because it will force elections, of course, and all of the people who are against the Netanyahu government will only have the Haredim to thank. It's rather ironic in a way.
Well, yes, all of the current opposition parties, I should say the Jewish opposition parties, will leave the Arab parties aside. They're not particularly invested or involved in this issue, but all of the Jewish opposition parties, right, left, and center, are all very much set on passing a conscription bill that would force the Haredim into the army. Everyone from Naftali Bennett on the right to Yair going on the left and Yair Lapid in the center have said that one of their main priorities, if they're able to form a coalition and run the next government, will be to bring the Haredim into the army. So if the Haredim, I think this is part of the reason why the Haredim have not done anything until now, because I think the thought on their side is as long as the government is not actively trying to force them in, then it's not as important if the enlistment bill gets passed. They can give Netanyahu a pass on that because the status quo is still being maintained because of a lack of enforcement. That's why this operation against draft dodgers was such a big deal, specifically because that seemed to break the tacit understanding they had with the prime minister, which is, we're not going to back down when we threaten to bring down the government over the draft bill, which is popular with their people, as long as you don't actually try to force us to go in.
Right. Okay. So, Sam, right now, the Haredi parties, I'm not sure about Shas, but at least the Ashkenazi parties, if I'm not mistaken, are having sanctions on the government. So what is that about? They're not voting for certain things. They're having some kind of punishment here. What's going on?
So Shas and United Torah Judaism, Shas representing Sephardic or Middle Eastern Haredim, and United Torah Judaism representing European Haredim, are currently engaged in a partial legislative boycott, meaning that they are not opposing government bills, but what they are opposing are the preliminary readings on private member bills brought by members of the coalition. Every Wednesday, the Knesset plenum votes on preliminary readings on bills brought by individual MKs from the coalition. Now, this would seem to be something that's minor because traditionally, the big important bills that were legislative priorities for governments and coalitions have been brought as government bills. But because the government legal advisors have been panning and criticizing so much of the legislation this government has been trying to bring, in order to circumvent the necessity of having the approval of these legal advisors, this government has been bringing its most important legislative priorities as private member bills. So what the Haredim are essentially doing right now is saying, we're not going to create a bad enough coalition crisis that we're going to, create an open breach and really make things much worse, but we want to show our anger by being enough of a pain in the ass that we're serious, by blocking some important priorities, but not a big enough pain in the ass that we are going to block things that have already advanced or are already in process. So they're trying to walk a very fine line between just blowing up everything and rolling over. So this is where a partial boycott comes in. But again, we're really heading towards a potential explosion. As Yuli Edelstein said, when his law is unveiled, it could blow things up. The Haredim have said that if they don't have a bill soon, that they are going to leave. They basically have said, we don't want our young people criminalized. So, there's a limit to how far things can go, I think. And I think the closer we get to the date of the next election, which is in October 2026, the more likely the Haredim are going to be to leave. It's very rare that a government fills its entire term. And when we get closer to the elections, it's likely that the Haredim are going to go, listen, we're going to elections soon anyway. Let's bring down the government in order to show to our voters that we're serious about this issue. So whether we're at that point yet or not really depends on a lot of factors. It depends on whether the army actually starts to engage in enforcement against draft dodgers. It depends on what this bill is that Edelstein brings out. And we're going to have to wait and see. But things right now within the coalition are very tense.
It's very tense within the coalition. It's very tense on the streets of Israel. Any kind of brush up between Haredim and secular Israelis now is definitely filled with all sorts of baggage that wasn't there before the war. And as you said, we're going to see how this all plays out. So, Sam, thank you so much for joining me today and giving us a little more of a complex window into Haredi society and all the different push-pull factors surrounding this very painful subject of Haredi conscription. So thank you so much.
My pleasure.
Thanks for listening to the Times of Israel's Friday Focus. Please check out another installment next week. This episode was produced by the Podwaves and video edited by Thomas Gersh. If you have any questions or comments about this or any other episode, please drop us an email to podcast@timesofisrael.com. Until next week, shalom.